Hey gang, Jason here from 117. Today I want to talk to you about online worship and how it's gonna look different. 117 is all about building community and educating people to reclaim God's love. And that community looks very different online than it does on Sunday mornings. And many of our churches across the country have chosen to meet virtually instead of in person so that they can practice social distancing. But for a lot of us, it comes at a time that we're not really prepared. We've never done online worship. It looks very different than it does on a Sunday morning, and we wonder if we're doing it right. Today I wanted to share with you some things that I've learned through the way and some of the things that I've picked up from others, and I want to encourage you that there are no experts when it comes to online worship. All of it has to be done in context. It matters as to what your church is used to, what your church is capable of doing, and what's going to reach your audience. So again, no experts, just experience. Now, early in my ministry, I had a little bit of experience filming messages. On Saturday nights, we would go into the church and we would film the sermon for Sunday morning to a packed crowd of nobody. Uh, it was terrible. It was challenging because you had no feedback from the congregation. It was frustrating because I wanted it to be perfect. And at the end of the day, it just was bad. We learned so much about what shots not to take, how to make it very unentertaining and unengaging, and we learned so much that context matters. We really needed to stop and rethink what exactly was our goal for this service. And for all of you trying to design online worship, that's the first place to start. What is your goal? Who is the audience that you want to reach? What do you want your worship service to do? For some of us, we just want to recreate the Sunday morning experience for people who are stuck at home. Typically, these would be our homebound persons who, because of age or infirmity, they can't come to worship on Sunday mornings. But for us today, we find that in a very different category. It's all of us as we're practicing social distancing. So maybe rebroadcasting for homebound is your niche, but maybe it's something else. Maybe you want your online worship to be an evangelism and outreach opportunity. You want to show off the skills and abilities of your congregation in your Sunday morning worship, and you want people to see that maybe this is a church that they want to check into. That goal is going to look very different in the way that we pursue it. The third option, maybe your goal is to communicate a message. Maybe you're really just about your teaching series and wanting people to continue in their spiritual growth and discipleship. Again, that'll be different from the first two. Now, there's a fourth option, of course, and for some, their goal is simply to create community, to maintain connections online, even at a distance. Again, context across all four of these goals. It's going to define your platform and your approach. Let's look briefly at each of these. For the Sunday morning rebroadcast for the homebounds, you'd be easy enough to set a camera in the back of the sanctuary and record worship. It's not going to be very engaging, but especially for our Catholic brothers and sisters who participating in the Mass or at least viewing the Mass is considered a grace, they feel included. They feel like they're an extension of the community. But the challenge when we do a rebroadcast like this is that you're really just watching service. You're not part of service. And it requires a strong pastoral care component to follow up after each Sunday. So even though right now we find ourselves in a time of social distancing, this might not be the option for us to choose. Now, the second option, the evangelism outreach option, that sounds great too. And all of us know that we've got the greatest sermon on Sunday morning and our music teams are just the best. But the reality is there are very few churches that can pull this off well. One of the best that we've ever seen is Craig Rochelle. His Life Church, they've been doing church online, on video from their birth. Video worship has been part of their DNA and culture from the time that they were created. And because of that, their worship services and their experiences are engaging, professional, and polished. They've invested a lot of money and a lot of talent in order to make sure that their Sunday morning experience can be translated through video. They have experienced camera and AV teams, and they're used to doing this. For the vast majority of us, that's not going to work. We're just not there. And trying to come up to speed in the midst of a couple of weeks, it's just not going to happen. And we need to be realistic with ourselves. What's possible? And really, what should we strive for? I think the third goal might be the best for most of us. We're really trying to communicate a message. For a lot of pastors and teachers these days, we might be in the middle of a teaching series, or especially because we find ourselves in the midst of Lent, we're walking with our congregations through a journey. Maybe you want to teach them about the spiritual disciplines, or maybe you have a focus for your Lenten series, and you want to continue that teaching. Your goal is discipleship. That's great. Then it doesn't have to be a full-blown Sunday morning service like you might be used to in the sanctuary. So I want to encourage you, first and foremost, just speak to your viewer. Do a simple headshot up close. You don't need anything far. You don't need anything crazy or wide. You want to use the rule of thirds. This divides your screen into 9 equal quadrants. And you'll notice at the top third is about where the eyes are going to line up. That's going to position the head with plenty of head space above and below. It's not going to feel crowded, and it's going to be a personal and intimate conversation with the person who's watching you. The second thing that we want to strive for when communicating a message is participation. Now, I know on Sunday mornings we're used to singing and responsive readings. Maybe you do the Psalter from the Psalms every week, but over the internet, it feels awkward. There's been plenty of times that my family has worshiped at home. And when the pastor says, hey, I want you to join in us in this responsive reading or sing along, it feels kind of weird, especially if you don't hear other people singing or other people talking. We live and operate in a herd mentality, and we listen for the voices of others to give us confidence in our participation. That simply might not be possible at home. And so we've got to find other ways to be experiential, other ways to engage people in worship. So maybe you want to use a powerful piece of special music. Maybe you have a band, a beautiful organ piece, or a choir that can present a piece that's very thought-provoking and meditative. Maybe you want to include art in your worship. Showing or sharing a piece of painting or a sculpture that means something to you and that ties into the message or the scripture of the day can be incredibly powerful, and it reaches an entirely different learning style. Speaking of learning styles, we also each have our own spiritual style that we bring to the table. Recently, I heard a pastor invite their participants to light a candle at home with them. That's a great way to start off the worship. Invite people to light a candle and invite the Holy Spirit into their home. Now you're reaching out, you're reaching through the video in ways that you maybe wouldn't do on a Sunday morning. The third thing that we need to consider is our setting. When you're taking a shot, you want to be careful that it's not too light and not too dark. A shot that's totally overexposed is too bright, you can't see the details, and the same is true in the reverse when it's way too dark. You want to look for a good background, a good balance where it's not overpowered by light or dark and you can see the details. A bad shot will draw away from your message. Also consider, where are you shooting the shot? I've seen recently some posts that were done from pastors' bedrooms, sitting in their beds. And maybe that's the only quiet place that you can find to record. I think it was Jimmy Kimmel this week who did a shot from a bathroom. They had musical guests playing there. Now for them it made sense because the acoustics was absolutely beautiful. But a pastor shooting a Sunday morning message from the toilet, I don't think that captures quite the same intimacy that you're looking for. Instead, you want to look for a shot that's neat and tidy. It doesn't have too much junk or too many things that distract from the nature of your message. You maybe want to choose a creative setting, one to match the theme. If you're talking about fellowship, you might choose a kitchen and clear off the countertops and make it look simple and neat. If you're talking about a contemplative Bible study, maybe you want to choose your home office or where you go to study and pray. I saw one pastor friend of mine this week. She connects really well into the woods with her deep green journey. And she did a simple video broadcast from nature. Others have become very creative in their own worship settings. They've found ways to invite the congregation back into the sanctuary, which is so familiar, and yet not make it feel so empty. Make me feel like I'm part of the shot. Invite me into your scene and your setting as an insider. Whatever you do, though, in your shot, be careful. A simple caution, people are going to wonder, why did you choose this shot? And so as you're being creative, don't be overly creative so as to be distracting. Make sure that you're truly engaging. Now, when we think about engagement, we also need to think about attire. For a lot of us on Sunday morning, you might wear a clergy robe, a stole, maybe you wear a suit or a tie or a dress. And if that's what feels right to you in your context, by all means, go with it. But if you find yourself shooting in a different venue than a sanctuary, maybe you want to consider an attire that matches your congregation. Now, for some pastors recently, that's been PJs. That's probably not quite the right look. We still want to maintain a certain level of professionalism and decorum as we move forward. Instead, you want to consider, how can you match your audience best? Maybe it's a hoodie or a thermal, or maybe it's a button down that's a little bit casual, or a jacket that's carried over top. Understand that you don't want to make your people feel uncomfortable, but at the same time, you don't want to make them feel too cozy in their PJs. It's that right balance that only you will find for your context. The fourth thing that we need to consider is equipment. And you're probably thinking, I've thought about this online worship thing, and I just don't have the skills or the equipment. It would cost too much money and take too much time to bring me up to speed. Nothing is further from the truth. These days, if you own a computer of some sort or a smartphone of some sort, you probably have the ability to do online worship and to make it look half decent. People aren't looking for perfect. If you look at the late night comedians, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, and the others, they're videoing their professional segments on their smartphones, usually with an iPhone or an Android. You don't need anything fancy. You can do it with what you have. But there's some basic fundamentals that you need to keep an eye out on. As you're shooting with your smartphone or your laptop, make sure that you have a stable base. Nothing is worse than movement. Moving the shot all around will drive people crazy and make them nauseous. Also, consider elevation. Elevation matters. I've seen lots of shots that are really low and the pastor is looking down at the camera. I've seen other shots that are taken from way up high and they give way too much headroom and it's confusing. Bring your shot on level. Make people comfortable, make them invited into the shot, and make it feel natural. A stable base with good elevation, whether it's on a laptop or a smartphone, means all the difference in the world. This might mean a simple tripod, or this might mean somebody resting their arms on a knee wall or another place where they can hold the phone steady. Now then, you're probably starting to wonder about software. How do I pull this all together? I used a fancy word a moment ago, post-production. That's after you've shot the video, how do you pull it together? Well, if you own a Mac, you probably own some simple software like iMovie. It came with your equipment. iMovie is a great place to pull it all together. Windows had something similar a couple of years ago called Movie Maker. Both of these products are great and they're going to capture exactly what you're looking for. But these days, Windows has eliminated the Movie Maker product, and you might need to go online looking for some freeware or some affordable software that would be a great alternative. As I was doing some research, I was quickly able to find Movavi, which seems to be a great option for you. Now, of course, there's professional equipment out there, software like Final Cut Pro and Adobe Premiere Pro. Those are going to be great, but they're also going to run upwards of $250 to $1,000. It can be super expensive, and that's not necessary. You can pull together a great video without too much stress. Stress. That's the next thing we need to think about. The fifth thing that we should consider is live streaming. I've noticed a lot of pastors are going to Facebook Live or YouTube live streaming, and they're trying to make sure that they do their Sunday morning worship at 9 a.m. just like they always do so that their congregation feels at home. Well, as wonderful as that is, that might be more work than it's worth. The payoffs might not be there. Have you ever considered pre-recording the worship service and then just playing it at 9 a.m.? The congregation and the online community is not going to know whether you shot this Friday night at 6 o'clock or Sunday morning at 8 a.m. They're really not going to notice unless a massive tragedy has happened over the weekend, and the reality is you're probably going to reshoot anyway. Take the stress off your plate. Pre-record, schedule it ahead of time. Give yourself time to make mistakes and to edit them out. You don't have to do it live every time, and you don't have to do it in one take. You can splice it all together. And then what you can do is you can schedule your post on Facebook and YouTube and other platforms. Then you can sit back and you can take in the message just like your congregation is. You can share in the comments and you can give feedback. Pre-recording is not a sin and it's not cheating. I encourage you, make it easy on yourself and you're going to create a better product for your people. Now, speaking of products, they need to know what they're getting. So many church services that I've seen online just give the name of the church and the date. Grace Church, worship, 329. That's great, but that doesn't tell me anything, and really, it doesn't motivate me to click on your link or your video. Instead, use all 70 characters that you get when naming a church service, when naming your experience. Give it an interesting name, like if you're preaching on fear, 4 ways to overcome fear. If you're preaching on the scriptural discipline of study, 7 steps to scriptural study. You're going to tell people, you're going to give them a little taste of what they can experience in the video and what they should look for. Now, speaking of engagement, a lot of you are probably starting to think about that 4th option that I had presented earlier, the whole creating community and creating connections. And as we do worship online, a lot of us, that's been our goal, is how do we also create community for our Sunday morning crowd who's having to practice social distancing? We need to understand that that's a different goal than communicating a message. Instead, I might encourage you to try a slightly different approach for community. Maybe you still want to record your Sunday morning experience, but then you can create some smaller groups of 10 or 15 people who engage together over Zoom or Skype or Google Groups. There's great freeware that's out there where people can meet together and they can have some feedback. That's a great time where you could sing a hymn together a cappella, or you could have a conversation about the scripture passage. You could even read the scripture passage together. As people hear one another's voices in real time, as you guide them through prayer, I've visited so many churches who people pray from the pews and they lift their prayer requests. If you had a group prayer time over Zoom, you'd be able to share those prayers and pray for one another. That will create the community, that will create the intimacy that you're looking for. But again, you've got to notice, it's a different platform and it's a different approach. As we're looking at different approaches, this might be a great time to also consider a prayer app. There's lots of great prayer apps out there, like Echo, Pray As You Go, My Daily Office. These are great things that allow your congregations to lift up prayers that they can pray for one another, and you can create groups. And for a lot of us, these last components feel essential to worship, and we can't imagine them apart from the message. But we need to understand and accept the fact that this looks different. Online worship is not your Sunday morning sanctuary. Online worship is going to feel different. It's not going to have the same community interactions, and it's not going to have the same community intimacy. We need to be creative in how we address these problems. Our ability to adapt to meet these challenges will determine our ability to survive, church. Speaking of survival, a lot of people have started to wonder about giving. Because the reality is, when the church isn't open, when people don't show up for worship, they usually don't give their tithe. And this has so many different levels to it. We can't oversimplify it. But the simple fact is, brothers and sisters, if pastors aren't willing to educate and communicate, then they can't expect their churches to be educated and communicated with. We need to take the burden, we need to take the mantle and help our churches understand the importance of giving and continuing the mission. I know you don't like to talk about money. Nobody does. But the reality is that talking about money will help your people and will ultimately help the people you're trying to reach. We need to share the importance of their local support. This Friday, I'm headed once again to help with a food pantry distribution because there are people in my town who will not eat if they are not being supported by our local food bank. The same is probably true in your area. Your church is an essential and vital part of the community support system. We need to share and educate that to our congregations. We need to invite people to send their checks by mail if that's your best approach. For others, they'll consider online giving. And there's lots of online giving platforms that you might consider. Some churches have a database, things like Planning Center, Servant Keeper, and Blackbaud. They all have an online giving component that you can purchase. It'll create a link for your website, you'll probably have a text to give option, and it'll automatically track the giving in your database. It's wonderful, it's streamlined, it's great. For others, you may need to seek out a third-party vendor. Your local bank might have the ability to set up electronic funds transfers, automatic withdrawals out of your congregants' accounts. For still others, you might look into a third-party app like PayPal, Patreon, or DonorBox. All of these different services allow you to collect giving online, which is going to be more reliable when people aren't meeting in person. Now understand that there is a fee to doing business like this. The fees range usually between 2 and 5%. The average fee for most of the church apps is going to be about 3%, and for the PayPal and Patreon types, you're going to be closer to 5%. But it's the cost of doing business. Losing 5% of your offering rather than losing 100% of your offering, I think that's worth it. That's the cost of getting us through this crisis and continuing the essential services that we need. You see, brothers and sisters, this is about creating community. This is about helping our communities through a difficult time and understanding that God has not forgotten them. And you haven't either. I encourage you, as you have questions, post them in this thread, post them below, email me, whatever it's going to take. I'm going to create some online opportunities for people to get together through Zoom. If you want to sign up for one of those and you want to ask a question there, that's great. If you want to like our links on Facebook and on YouTube for 117, that'd be awesome. We would really appreciate it. My name is Jason, and this is 117.